welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jenn, and I'm here with an author whose work I have read a couple of volumes of, two, three, I think, at this point, and I'm so interested in the connections between them and all the unique things they do. So let's get into it. Hello, could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, hi. So my name's Gracias. I've got my third book out, which is called Dogboy V Catfish. And this is completely different from my other two books. By profession, I am an environmental specialist. I have been working in the field for almost 30 years now. And that would probably be my number one passion, with writing coming a close second.
That's so interesting. And I'm so glad to talk about your work and how all these things connect. So, yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about how you got started writing and what your journey to this book was like.
So as I mentioned earlier, I'm an environmental engineer by profession, and we're all learning and finding a way to save our world. For this to happen, we need everybody to be on board, and the best way to get everyone on board is through stories. Film is a wonderful media to tell stories, and I ventured into the film industry. My first success was bringing a large Bollywood film to be shot in Australia. It inspired me to get into script writing. And from there, I wrote a script called The Devil's Prayer. When the film funding fell through, I decided it was best to convert this film script into a novel. And the novel won the Best Australian Horror Novel 2016 and the Shadow Awards finalist. And from there, I went to my second book, which was No Shadow Without Light. It is a sequel. I wrote it during COVID. It was a depressing, lonely time, and writing gave me a reason to get out of bed. Suddenly, I had all these characters in my mind. I was plotting their journey. I was alive again, living vicariously through their adventures. And then in January this year, for the first time, I had no work, and there was nothing on the horizon. It was absolutely eerie. I had never experienced something like this before, but I remembered how writing had got me out of bed. And I decided to write Dogboy V Catfish about divorce laws and male suicide. As you know, in the author's note, or you may know in the author's note, I wrote about a late night phone call, which inspired this latest book. And we will talk about that later in this episode.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And I still love, as a little side point, that so many authors I talk to are still talking about projects that they wrote either during or immediately after the pandemic. And it was such a hard time for the world. And I feel like it made a lot of people write very personal works or very challenging works, and I that's there's not a lot of bright sides to that whole situation, but I think we've gotten a lot of like very interesting creative works out of it in some ways. So as you have said, you've worked in a couple other spaces. You've mentioned your environmental work and in the film industry. Your website or another interview I read also says that you're an avid photographer. And I'm wondering, have these experiences shaped your interests as a writer and how you approach your work? And do you think they give you any interesting or unique strategies in your writing?
Absolutely. I got into writing, as I said earlier, because I ventured into film. And if there was one book which terrified me as a teenager, it was The Omen. And if there was one book that I wish I had written, it was the Da Vinci Code. I decided to write a Da Vinci Code of The Omen. This was my first project, and that was The Devil's Prayer. And I spent time finding and taking photographs of obscure and unexplained locations, architecture, artifacts, and history from around the world. For example, the Devil's Bible is a real book. It's the largest medieval manuscript. It exists in the National Library of Sweden. And it has 12 missing pages that are rumored to contain the Devil's Prayer, which is the basis of my first book. My second book, No Shadow Without Light, is a sequel. And in the late 80s, as you said, with COVID, it inspired us to do some things that were these really off the charts things. In the late 80s, Gro Brundtland, the then Prime Minister of Norway, pulled all the brains together of the planet to take a stock take of what we had and plan the way forward, chart the way forward. The results of this stock take were compiled in a book called Our Common Future, and this book inspired my career. And I decided to write the second book during COVID of a second stock take of our planet today and what we would leave for the next generations in 2050. Telling such a dire tale with facts and figures was never going to be easy, but it had to be said. And I decided to write historical fiction to tell a scientific story. No Shadow Without Light has not been a commercial success, but it is in the Vatican libraries. My last book, Dogboy V Catfish, was something I wanted to write about how entitlement has changed the world we live in today, about how truth and trust are casualty when someone is willing to win at any cost, and about how it has impacted relationships and the values we hold dear today.
Yeah, what I really love about all of that is that, we've mentioned that you've written across so many genres, a lot of which you've just mentioned, but you see those same interests popping up again. So there's a lot of like thematic coherence, I think, about the modern world that you put into all these different genres. And I'm wondering, like, what types of stories or characters in particular do you find yourself drawn to writing? Do you find yourself drawn to particular types of characters or personalities that you like to explore these ideas through?
It's actually the types of stories. And I think that, conflict drives a story, and there's certain things that are conflicting in our lives today. My first book, as I said earlier, was aimed to be a Da Vinci Code version of The Omen. And The Devil's Prayer is all about the coming of the Antichrist and Armageddon, and all the texts in the world, religious texts, the signs, etc., are all there. I mean, if there is no Armageddon, then there is no thing to pay religions to protect you from it or whatever. And my first book was horror and historical fiction and had a lot of graphic rape and things and was not suitable for readers under 18. I changed genre in my second book, even though it was a sequel, because I wanted it's about environment. And I wanted to reach a broader and wider audience and didn't want to have that restriction of R18+. So my second book is about the environmental crisis we face. The missing pages of The Devil's Prayer contain apocalyptic texts, which are needed by the Antichrist to bring about Armageddon. And it actually has, each of the pages has one of the tools of survival that we are today destroying future generation, and things like that. And so these are the tools we are progressively destroying. And I chose to write the second book as historical fiction with very little horror, because I wanted to get into the year 12s, the year 11 students and stuff like that. So this book has also been, wanted it to be more accessible to a global audience. It became, as I said, it was in India, Crossword is the largest book chain, which controls about 70%. It was Crossword Book of the Month for 2 months running. And then to add to that, as I said, it got pulled in because there was a wonderful painting of the Stefaniaki triptych, which is in the Pinacoteca Vaticana, that I wanted a picture of. I wrote to the Vatican asking to put pictures in this book along with my photographs for a change. And the Vatican wrote back and said, because I wrote what my book was about, and I talked about it in the form of Noah's Ark, and talked about the fact that if Noah had decided to take 4 elephants, he'd have to throw out the tigers or the lions or something. And today we have modified this ark called Planet Earth to put 8 billion people on it at the cost of every other species. And I said, look, this is what my book's about. And so the Vatican wrote back and said, we do charge, but the charge is going to be, you're going to have to give us 3 copies to put in our libraries. And I thought, that's a good price to pay.
Yeah.
So it was very good. And and of course, my third book, Dogboy V Catfish, is a crime thriller. It's about social issues, male suicide, separation, and entitlement. If there's one common thread in my books, they all have female protagonists.
Mm, mhm.
Okay, and the first two books, the female protagonists are the leads, and in the last one, Catfish, the nemesis.
I
There
do
you go.
find that so fascinating. And I do love that, across these genres, yes, you do see some of these commonalities. And I think another thing that I see is, to different degrees in them is about like feelings of isolation sometimes in a very global world. Like it's always very aware of the wider world and sort of like the place of the individual and kind of like exploring that. So that's something I find really interesting too. Do you mind if I ask you to speak on that a little bit?
Sorry, you need to repeat the question.
Oh, sure. Do you find yourself drawn to talking about, people in a global world, in that sort of wider framework, because I feel like there's a lot of uh questioning about what is a person supposed to do in this very modern hyper connected world. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think we are getting more and more time for each day because there is more and more asked of us, even though there are more of us, and the competition is getting fiercer and fiercer. It's I always say this is we grew up in simple times, and I think my parents grew up in even simpler times. We are a very polarized world today. We have got and everything has got is only popular if it's polarized. If it's not, it doesn't. And so writing has to be there where you're going to get some people who love your book and others who hate it, and that's just I think the best thing as a writer you look at today is not the 1 stars, it's the 3 stars are the worst, right in the middle. If you've got a 1 and a 5, you're probably doing all right, because if someone loves your book, the balance of life is such that someone has to hate it.
Yes, I
It's
agree.
just it's a polarized world today, unfortunately. That's where we're in. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, your books do a very good job of sort of exploring the problems created, I think, by that polarized world sometimes. And that's something I'm very interested in. So let's move to your newest book. Can you tell our listeners who are Dogboy and Catfish?
So at the end of the book, in the author's note, I write about an incident which inspired Dogboy V Catfish. It was about 2 a.m., called July night. So we are in the Southern Hemisphere, as you know, and July is our winter. And I had turned off, I'm a night owl, I had turned off my computer and I was about to shut down for the night, and my phone rang. And I answered it expecting to hear the rustle of a pocket dial, as you do, 2 in the morning. The voice at the end of the line was devoid of all hope. It was not someone I knew really well, not a very close friend. My mate was standing at the Gap in Sydney, Australia. This is Australia's most famous suicide location. And he had been through a messy divorce, and his ex-wife had taken him to the cleaners. He had brought up her kids as his own, and now he was liable for their upkeep till they turned 18. She had even cleaned out his inheritance before she decided to leave. He was about to jump. He called to say goodbye, and all I could think of was to say, let's do this properly. Let's have a drink. That's always going to be there. You can go back and jump another day. Dogboy did not jump. We never spoke of that incident again. The truth is, suicide never hurts the person or injustice which led you to its precipice. It devastates those who would have benefited from your ongoing presence in their lives. Mm-hmm. And Dogboy is not one person, but the many males who have considered suicide, especially after a failed relationship. 7 out of 9 suicides in Australia are men. 7. Right? As for Catfish, you have all met her. Or him. Or him. Dogboy is naturally a giver, and Catfish is a taker, and that is why they're always drawn to each other. You will always find the nicest women with the worst men, and the nicest men with the worst women. This is because of this giving-taking relationship that occurs. Because if someone is willing to give, there is always someone who will be happy to be manipulative and take. Mm-hmm. If there is one word to describe Catfish, it is entitled. In the novel, Catfish shared the ability to communicate with dogs, which might perhaps tell some readers that she once grew up with the soul of a dog. However, some of life experiences made her bitter and manipulative. And that's the sad story of a lot of people. They change with life. So that's about Dogboy and Catfish.
It's such an interesting story, and the characters are so interesting and they're dynamic. And something that you do very well here is you balance that character work with a plot that is very riveting and has a really great pace that keeps you reading. So how do you approach balancing character and plot when you are planning your story?
So it's actually, all my stories are plot driven. Like I started with the premise that I said to you earlier, which was Da Vinci Code version of The Omen. Our Common Future, rewritten in 2050, to 2050, the second book. This one was, again, plot-driven, and the fact of the matter is that the key with Dogboy is that a missing person has more rights than someone who's alive. And, in my stories are plot-driven, so each character has to have a goal to meet that plot. They're very clear goals, and once you have these clear goals in the character, then you know who the person's going to be. So now that you've got this person and they've got these goals. So, for example, Dogboy is a nerd, a financial wizard who's awkward around women. And the first person I thought of, and it's in the book, is his friends describe him. He's like Chandler Bing from the sitcom Friends. That's the kind of thing. And it's then you've got this character to build around. In my debut novel, Denise Russo is a single mother, and she will do anything to protect her children. Now, all her decisions are made based on that one overarching goal, to protect her children. And then everything is justified. Whether she kills people, she brutally murders them, if it's to protect her kids, it's justified. And then the reader thinks. So when I write, I actually get into the character of each person on the page and think about what they would do to achieve these goals. Because if you write a complex story, you have to have characters that have got very straight lines. Or otherwise, the reader gets very confused and your story slows down. I mean, conflict drives the story. So as long as you've got that conflict, and you know the conflict, and you know what the character is going to do to overcome that conflict because of their goals, if you make their wishy-washy, you confuse your readers and slow the story. So it is actually quite a simple process for me. As I just look, okay, they can't be multi-layered and indecisive. Yeah.
That's so interesting, because I think I've always thought of a person's goals as coming from their personality, but then those goals can also change you, I think, as you do more things to achieve them and do things that you might not have done in the past. And so I think it's a very good storytelling technique that you use here. It's also a crime story. Well, we've already talked about some elements of the crime in there. But what I love about crime fiction is that it gives you a really deep dive into a subculture, into a very secretive, complicated little corner of the underworld. And I love that we get to do that here by exploring the illegal counterfeit industry, which is like a portion of things going on here. So can you talk about what drew you to that? And did you do a lot of research to explore that world? Or I guess, how do you prepare to write about a world like that people might not know a lot about?
I knew very little about it too when I started. I knew there were huge markups in the designer good industry, but when I came across handbags, ladies' handbags like the Hermes Birkin, which sold for over $200,000, this made me stop and think. $200,000 plus, right? The fact that blew me away the most was that the fake designer good market has actually got more value than the entire exports of Australia. More than all our iron ore, all our coal, all our gas, all the gold, all the tourism, all the agriculture. And when I looked at that, I knew there was the making of a really good story. And then the research was basically all based about making sure that if someone checked on the plot, it could be authenticated, lock, stock, and barrel. So then you go down the whole route of going through the police files, you go through kind of things that, what are procedures? You start finding about in agencies like React, you start finding about, these fake designer good markets, which I never knew existed, that a Tag Heuer empty box can cost $250. And with the receipt, it's $500, and you go, surely that's a red flag. But that's what it is, And so the book talks about these things that have become so central and valuable, but yet not really valuable in this whole thing. So that's where I got it from. Yeah.
Interesting. And it plays into, I think, a lot of the themes of entitlement in the book in a lot of ways, because I think another thing that I see happening is like people wanting things that aren't theirs and wanting to live a life that they don't, currently live, that is not theirs, and being willing to do things to get what they want, even if they're not fully legal. I loved this story so much, and it was so fascinating. And I'm wondering, like, what's next for you? Do you see yourself working in this genre again, or are you going to switch things up?
Film or TV series? I think Dogboy V Catfish would make a fantastic film.
Yes.
Right? It's got all the pitch points that you got. You got the inciting incidents. You've got you've got a second act, and it's actually written in 3 books, so you've actually got the 3 acts in there. It is, and if you come to the end of second act, when Catfish basically wins and all is lost, it is exactly the end of the second act. It's written as a film script. The Devil's Prayer and No Shadow Without Light would make a phenomenal TV series. I mean, it is across the most fascinating locations around the world that we have never been able to explain. I mean, the back story, the very first line in No Shadow Without Light at the back is, on the 6th of June, 2006, the world population crossed 6.66 billion. And that is a fact. The 666 of the devil, things like that. And there were other things like Timor's grave and Timor's curse, and there's just one fact after the other that we just haven't been able to explain. The Operation Barbarossa, where Hitler goes into Russia on the day when they opened up Timor's grave, and Barbarossa is red beard, which is basically what they found out on that day, that Timor was redhead with a red beard. Timor. I think Timor Lane, whatever. So things like that. It has these fascinating locations, fascinating plot, but it's a big budget film. I also have a rom-com which I have written. It was actually my first piece of work, and was called Haven't Met You Yet. And last week, the Indian government and Australian government signed a co-production treaty. And I'm thinking very strongly about pitching this as I love the 80s music. I'm telling you my age with that. But I plan to pitch it to a music artist to release as a film, and then an album of 80s covers. And what's next for me, of course, my first love is my environmental work. I'm doing some of the most fascinating. I have a dream job. I am working with algae to biofuels. I'm working with decarbonization. We're working with things like that. And I just hope I can win a few battles before, time runs out. And then, of course, I'll be compelled to write again. Another book, maybe, another script. Who knows? That's what the future holds.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So that's so exciting to hear. I agree with you. I think these works would make great films and TV shows respectively. And yeah, I love the idea of this rom-com. And so yeah, good luck. And I hope it all happens. And if you ever want to come back to the show to talk about any other work, you're always welcome back. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right, listeners, now it is your turn. Please go check out Dogboy V Catfish. It is an absolutely riveting novel. I could not put it down. And yeah, in your head, just imagine like the great movie it would make, okay? Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.